Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This column is written by the chairperson of the UN Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances. So, the subject of this column is enforced disappearances of citizens at the hands of authoritative governments. See, enforced disappearances refers to cases of missing citizens where they are either kidnapped or detained, or worse, tortured and killed by government agencies or by government sponsored agencies. Such enforced or involuntary disappearance is a common feature of authoritative governments, and they often use it as a weapon to stifle free speech and expression, especially those who are criticizing the government and the rulers. And they even use it as a weapon in conflict zones to target their opponents or any rebels who are challenging their authority. Even in several countries which appear to be moderate and democratic, even in such countries, authoritative governments led by authoritative leaders can misuse the security and intelligence agencies to target those who are criticizing the government, including opposition leaders, whistleblowers, etc. And even journalists and activists are not spared either. Then, in conflict zones, the opponents and the rebel groups are also targeted, and any individual who is causing discomfort to the authoritative government is forcefully or involuntarily disappeared by the security agencies. All of this is done in the name of state security and sometimes in the name of counterterrorism. And such acts of enforced disappearances, according to the writer, is a gross violation of human rights. In this column, the writer, who happens to be the chairperson of the UN Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances, focuses on few Asian countries where such incidents have been reported. He cites the example of Myanmar and how the military dictators have often sponsored the kidnapping and illegal detention and even torture and killing of several of their own citizens who were opposed to the military rule. Then in China, in the Xinjiang province, Uyghur minorities have been targeted by Chinese security agencies, as the Uyghurs, who have felt oppressed under the hands of China, have taken up radicalism and extremism, and have even set up a terrorist outfit known as ETIM, or the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, with the objective of liberating Xinjiang from China. So, in the name of de radicalization and counterterrorism, Chinese authorities have often kidnapped or illegally detained Uyghur minorities, and they even send them to so called re education camps, where their human rights are not only violated, but in many cases, the state agencies don't even disclose the whereabouts or the details of those who have been detained or kidnapped illegally. Even Sri Lanka has reported many such enforced disappearances, especially during the peak of the civil war. And in this case, it was the Tamil minorities who were at the receiving end of the atrocities that were committed by a Sinhala Buddhist majority government. Then, of course, in Pakistan, the deep state, that is led by the Pakistani army and the ISI, has even been held responsible for several such enforced disappearances. And many journalists, opposition leaders, and critics of the Pakistani deep state have been targeted, and hundreds of such individuals have gone missing, only to be found dead years later. Such incidents have even taken place in Bangladesh, and even in India, such cases of enforced disappearances have been reported in India's conflict zones, such as Jammu and Kashmir, the northeast of India, the Naxal corridor, etc. In the case of India, the Supreme Court, the National Human Rights Commission, and several committees have taken note of such enforced disappearances. And this illegal, undemocratic act of authoritative governments has been labeled as a gross violation of human rights by the United Nations. The writer points out that such enforced disappearances sponsored by the state became widely known in the 1970s and 1980s during Argentina's dirty war. In this conflict, Argentina's military dictatorship was accused of being responsible for the forced disappearance of around 30,000 people who were allegedly kidnapped and later tortured and even murdered by the military dictatorship. Following this dirty war of Argentina, the then United Nations Commission on Human Rights which is the predecessor organization to the UNHRC or the UN Human Rights Council, decided to set up the UN Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances in 1980. This UN Working Group became responsible for implementing the UN Declaration on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. Under this mandate, the UN Working Group became responsible for assisting the families, that is, the victim families, which were affected by such enforced disappearances. Whenever such complaints or reports came up, the UN Working Group was supposed to assist the families in investigating these cases in order to find out the whereabouts of the victim. And through this declaration, the UN Working Group was also empowered to monitor those governments and those states to check whether they were complying with the provisions of this declaration. The UN took up this matter very seriously because such enforced or involuntary disappearances is a direct violation of an individual's liberty, which is a basic fundamental right in any constitutional democracy, because such disappearances are carried out against the will of the individual. And since these disappearances are illegal and since they are done in a secretive manner, governments don't even acknowledge such detentions. And this failure to acknowledge denies the victim any recourse to legal routes and snatches away the fundamental right of the victim to seek justice from the courts and to hold those governments accountable for these grave acts of human rights violation. The writer points out that global efforts are needed from the international community to combat such enforced disappearances because this is a continuous crime. It is not a crime which is committed against just one individual. It is a continuous crime that is committed against several individuals, or worse, against several groups and communities. And hence, it's very important for the international community to wake up and act against such governments, as it causes immense suffering not only to the victim but also to their families. The worst part in such cases of illegal detention is that the family members do not get any closure, and for years and decades together, they are not even aware whether the victim is dead or alive, and this causes severe mental and emotional trauma to the families of victims. To counter these enforced disappearances and to hold governments accountable, the United Nations even came out with an international convention in 2006 known as the International Convention for Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. This convention came into force in 2010, but unfortunately, only 98 countries have signed the convention, and out of them, just 63 countries have ratified the convention. India, for example, is one of the signatories to the convention, but India is yet to ratify this convention. Since the writer is discussing the issue from an Asian context, he points out that very few countries from the Asia Pacific region have ratified the convention, and this includes Cambodia, Japan, Mongolia, and Sri Lanka. Apart from these four, none of the other Asian countries in the Asia Pacific region have ratified the convention, and this goes on to show the lack of seriousness amongst governments in fighting against such enforced or involuntary disappearances. Hence, the writer calls upon the global community and the governments to sign and ratify this convention and work together to put an end to this crime of enforced disappearances. Now let's take up a column from page number 7, which deals with the need for reforms in India's medical education sector. See, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the critical gaps in India's healthcare system. By overwhelming our hospitals, the pandemic has exposed the critical shortage of human resources in our healthcare system, which happens to be one of the critical building blocks for putting in place a quality healthcare system. Sufficient number of healthcare workers, including doctors, nurses, and the others, are an absolute must if a country's healthcare system has to strive towards achieving the healthcare goals under the SDG targets. This column particularly evaluates the critical shortage of doctors reported in India, which has directly affected the quality of healthcare in the country and as well as placed an immense strain on the healthcare system, which has been overwhelmed and overburdened as a result of the pandemic. See, amongst the major economies, India reports one of the lowest doctor to population ratio, and this shortage of doctors is quite critical in the northern states as compared to the southern states. In South India, apart from Telangana, most of the states have sufficient doctors, whereas a majority of the northern states report a serious shortage of doctors. Apart from this regional divide with regard to availability of adequate human resources, we also witness a urban rural divide because in the rural areas again there is a critical shortage of doctors which is directly compromising the quality of healthcare in India. So to solve this problem, the government has embarked upon a series of reforms focused upon the medical education sector, but unfortunately the government has relied excessively on a market oriented approach. The current initiatives of the government is focused on scaling up medical education in the country, primarily through investments from the private sector at the cost of declining public investments in medical education. For example, recently the Niti Aayog came up with a controversial proposal. The Niti Aayog has proposed the conversion of district hospitals into private medical education centers, through which the district hospitals can be corporatized and the private investors can be encouraged to set up medical colleges in these district hospitals. And the Niti Aayog considers this to be a win-win situation for all. While this proposal seems to be very attractive, it has also raised a number of concerns. See, in India's rural areas, where healthcare is already limited, the district hospitals are serving as the nerve center where the poor people in the lower sections of the society can access basic healthcare that too free of cost. So now, in order to increase medical seats, if these district hospitals are corporatized and if private investors are allowed to take over, they might help in scaling up the medical education sector and they might help in increasing the number of doctors. But the privatization of district hospitals will deny essential healthcare to the poor because then these paid services might become unaffordable, thereby further increasing health inequality, particularly in the rural areas. The writer argues that when private entities are encouraged to take up medical education, they will always look at it as a business and they will always be driven by the profit motive. While this is not wrong by itself, and while the private sector can bring in a number of advantages, it fails to fulfill a number of social objectives which can be satisfied only through public investments. For example, when the government relies excessively on the private sector to scale up medical education, then even though they might provide high quality medical education, they will essentially run these colleges as a business with a profit motive, thereby denying access to several deserving aspirants who may not be able to afford these colleges. And this in turn has a direct impact on healthcare in the rural areas. Because several poor aspirants from rural areas would be more than willing to serve in their native places. But these eligible and talented aspirants might be denied seats because of the high cost of medical education. At the same time, those aspirants who take up these seats, they will not be interested in working in rural areas because naturally any student would look to recover their investments and hence they would seek out plush openings in corporate hospitals. So this, according to the writer, fails to fulfill the social objectives of equitable medical access. And such an excessive focus on private medical education is also not in line with the principles and provisions of our national health policy. The writer is of the opinion that excessive reliance on the private industry to scale up medical education will only increase health inequity, and hence there is an urgent need for a complete rethink amongst our political leadership to work out a suitable, sustainable long-term solution. And the answer to this lies in treating medical education as a public good and not as a private business or as an enterprise. See, previously the government has even experimented with the PPP model or the public-private partnership model. But even this model has given us limited success and its effectiveness is not entirely proven. Because even under the PPP model, the private industry is always driven by the profit motive. And when the social objectives are prioritized, the private investors lose motivation. And hence, when it comes to quality healthcare and quality medical education, it has to be state-led and it has to be led through public investments. Now, there are numerous examples around the world to justify this argument. You look at any developed nation or any country with quality healthcare, you will find that Their healthcare systems are largely driven by the public sector, that is, through government investments, and not through private business or private enterprise. Yes, private investments and private hospitals can supplement the resources of the government, but they can never be a replacement to public investment because private healthcare can never satisfy the social objectives of healthcare. Hence, the writer is calling upon the Indian government to carry out a complete rethink at the highest levels of the political leadership in order to work out a long term sustainable solution through which public investments can be stepped up with regard to medical education, with the opening of new colleges, along with the strengthening of existing infrastructure in current colleges, followed by the sufficient allocation of financial support and essential infrastructure and resources, so that the output of doctors in the country can be stepped up in order to bridge this critical shortage. Now let's take up another editorial from page number 6 that helps us understand the current status of the Indian economy. See, since the last year, the pandemic and the lockdowns have had a huge impact on the Indian economy, and industrial production not only came to a halt and contracted, but also inflation, that is, retail inflation, started rising over the last few months as a result of the massive stimulus that was announced by the government and the RBI in order to revive demand and promote growth in the Indian economy. As you might know, promoting growth and containing inflation are conflicting objectives, and the RBI, through its monetary policy, and the government, through its fiscal policies, have the challenging objective of maintaining price stability, that is, containing inflation, while taking steps to promote growth. And this has always been a challenge for the government and the RBI. After several months of high inflation, it seems that finally there is some respite because the latest data from the National Statistical Office shows that retail inflation, that is CPI based inflation, has slowed down to a 3-month low of 4.29% in April. This level of inflation is well within the target of 4% that has been prescribed to the Monetary Policy Committee of the RBI, with a flexibility range of plus or minus 2%. Then, along with this, the index of industrial production has witnessed a major surge, and the industrial output for March has jumped by a massive 22.4%, thereby signaling an increase in industrial activity. However, this large jump in IIP could also be because of the base effect, because last year, that is in March 2020, industrial growth had slumped and contracted by 18% as a result of the lockdown. But the data makes it clear that industrial activity has revived in the last few months, and parallelly, the declining retail inflation, particularly food inflation, should provide some relief to the RBI and the government. Across food items, including vegetables, fruits, dairy products, and even pulses, inflation has come down. But this shouldn't result in the RBI losing its focus on price stability and inflation control. Because still there are several negative side risk factors for inflation, and this includes continued high prices of meat products, increasing cost of transportation and communication, and as well as the upside pressure on fuel prices, especially because of increasing global oil prices. Along with this, international commodity prices have also surged significantly in the last few months, and they all represent a negative risk for inflation in India. Then the PMI index, that is the Purchasing Managers Index, which is brought out by IHS Market, has also shown that for April, industrial activity has gone down as a result of lockdowns, which have been triggered by the second wave of the pandemic. The PMI index for April shows that new orders in industries and the output have gone down, and this also represents a negative risk for growth in the economy. Hence, the editorial is calling upon the policymakers, that is, both the RBI and the government, to remain vigilant with regard to price stability while taking sufficient steps to boost growth and revive demand in the economy. Now, let's take up an important article from page number 10 that deals with the contradicting stand that India has taken over the question of IP rights for vaccines and drugs. See, over the last few weeks, we have been discussing repeatedly that at the World Trade Organization, India and South Africa proposed a joint resolution last year seeking a temporary waiver of patent protection for essential vaccines and drugs in order to scale up the production of these vaccines so that developing and underdeveloped countries can have fair, affordable, and universal access to COVID vaccines and medicines. Recently, this proposal of India and South Africa was backed by US, France, and Russia as well. And India has argued at the WTO that some of the WTO members have carried out emergency legal amendments to their respective patent laws in order to speed up the process of issuing compulsory licenses, which allows a government to bypass the restrictions of a patent. See, under the WTO mechanism, compulsory licensing is allowed in case of a public health emergency, and this authorizes the government to bypass the patent restrictions and license other companies to manufacture the generic version of these drugs, even though these products are patent protected. Without the approval of the patent owner, the government can license other companies to produce generic versions of these drugs in order to help the government to deal with a public health emergency. Of course, the licensed manufacturers will pay a royalty to the patent owner, but however, it helps in overcoming the patent restrictions and enables the government to serve a larger public purpose. So essentially at the WTO, the government has taken a stand in favor of compulsory licensing, and it has called for a resolution seeking a temporary patent waiver. But in contrast, at the Supreme Court, the government of India has contradicted itself by appearing to take a stand against compulsory licensing. See, the Supreme Court is looking into a case which involves the center, and the subject matter of the case deals with compulsory licensing and government acquisition of patents in the light of the deadly second wave of the pandemic that has hit India. In this ongoing case, the center has taken the opposite stand, and it has informed the Supreme Court that if any ill thought out premature decisions are taken with regard to compulsory licensing, then it could have a negative unintended consequence on India's image as a protector of patent rights. The government has cited the restrictions posed by the Patents Act of 1970 and the WTO TRIPS Agreement and the Doha Declaration, and it has expressed its inclination to the Supreme Court to not favor compulsory licensing as of now. In this context, it becomes important to see what the TRIPS Agreement and the Doha Declaration have to say about compulsory licensing. See, under the TRIPS Agreement of the WTO, Article 30 and 31, they deal with exceptions to the rights of patent owners, and they allow the grant of compulsory licenses as I explained. These articles of the TRIPS Agreement allows governments to determine how the compulsory license or government use levers can be triggered. In the 2001 Doha Declaration to the WTO, it was laid out that TRIPS should be interpreted in a manner that is supportive of the rights of the member states to protect public health, especially in case of public health emergencies, and to promote the access of the government and the public to essential medicines and drugs. Under Para 5, Clause B, it has been laid down that freedom has been granted to each member to grant compulsory licenses and determine the exact grounds on which these compulsory licenses can be granted. And Clause C states that each nation, that is each member state to the WTO, can determine as to what exactly constitutes a national emergency or extreme urgency. So it's very clear that these provisions of the TRIPS Agreement and the Doha Declaration, they actually favor the government in issuing compulsory licenses during a public health emergency. And this is exactly the same stand that the government has taken at the WTO while seeking this temporary waiver with regard to patent protection. But surprisingly, at the Supreme Court, the government seems to be taking a contradicting stand, and the government has informed the Supreme Court that bringing vaccines under the Patents Act and subjecting them to the provisions of TRIPS Agreement and Doha Declaration can be counterproductive. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question, write a detailed note on enforced disappearances with an examination of related international laws and conventions. The second question, India's healthcare system has been facing a serious human resource crunch during the pandemic. What measures do you suggest to reform the medical sector? Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. This concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.